Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom in our continuing discussion of the period of European exploration, right? Now, let's pick right where we left off in class, talking about the expedition and the expansion of what would soon become the Spanish Empire in the Americas, right? So where we left off in class, we were talking about the voyage of Columbus, right? We were discussing how Isabella and Ferdinand are going to be the ones who sponsor his voyage, and how originally he was, of course, trying to go west to catch a ride to India, right? Now, in his mind, he thought he was going to head west, maybe knock into the Azores and some other stuff like that, but he thought eventually he was going to hit China in this area right here. Well, too bad for him, he didn't realize that he's actually going to run completely into the Bahamas, the Caribbean, and then two other continents that he didn't know was there, right? So the big thing about it, though, is that the discovery of this quote-unquote new world, right, of course, is not even really new. It's been there for a really long time, and it had already been discovered by the Native Americans. But the big thing about it is this is going to then cause a chain reaction of events that are going to lead to violence, genocide, conquest, and also economic growth, right? It's a very, very weird thing to talk about because you're actually going to have to, we're going to have to like talk and understand how literally the interaction of the Europeans with the natives is going to lead to extreme loss of life, violence, and prejudice, and the forced expansion of religions onto people that didn't ask for them. And then also on the same token, it's going to lead to the Europeans making more money than you could ever imagine, right? So we saw that a little bit with like the gold jewelry, right? Of course, whenever Columbus like interacts with the Taino, people of the Bahamas, and they're wearing gold jewelry, he asks you how much do you have of that? And they're like, we don't have a lot, but there's some people next door that have a ton, right? Now the thing about it though is those conquests are not going to kick off immediately, right? There's actually going to be a couple of other developments that actually occur in the process of this entire story, right? Now, going into it, for example, one of the biggest things that's going to come down the pipe is this thing called the Treaty of Tordesillas, right? And the Treaty of Tordesillas is going to be actually written by this guy named Pope Alexander VI. Yes, the same exact pope that is going to be the guy that actually is the illegitimate father of Caesar Borgia, the guy that Niccolo Machiavelli wrote his Prince book about, right? The Treaty of Tordesillas, though, was written by Alexander VI in the hopes of trying to prevent a war between Spain and Portugal. Now, at the time, whenever this is going on, Protestantism didn't exist, and it's a growing Catholic, and both of the powers that had just discovered the route to India, around Africa, through Vasco da Gama and the Portuguese, and then also now the North and South American, access points underneath the Spanish and Columbus, are going to stand to make tons and tons of money. Now, that also means, though, that the Pope and the Church stand to make tons and tons of money. Because remember that concept of the tithe, right? Remember the fact that the tithe is a 10% amount of money that the Church is getting every single week from all of its parishioners, including Isabella and Ferdinand, Vasco da Gama, and other individuals that are involved with this expansion. Hey, quit licking. All right, stop it. Sorry, I got a dog that's bothering a thing. Now, the thing about, though, going into it is that the Pope is going to draw this line known as the line of demarcation, also known as the Treaty of Tordesillas, right? And literally what it's going to do is put a big fat line right down the middle of the globe and be like, all right, Spain, you get what is now known as this New World area, North and South America. And Portugal, you're going to get access to the trade routes that include mostly India, the Indian Ocean, all the stuff around Africa, right? Now, of course, they ended up having to actually do the Treaty of Saragossa and then actually draw another one a little bit later on due to the fact that Spain kind of went and kept going west. But the big thing about it, though, is they didn't find anything new and extra out there, and it is going to lead to a basically Dominion-style empire, right, where North and South America would be here, and that's going to be controlled by the Spanish, and then, of course, Portugal's going to get all this. It reminds me a lot of this moment in Full House.
Rule number 1, never touch my stuff. You should be taking notes. Rule number 2, never set foot on my half of the room. How do I get out of here?
Yeah, exactly. The one where Stephanie and DJ draw a line down the middle of their room and stuff like that to try and prevent each other from touching anything. And all of this was to try and avoid war, because if they make war with each other, they will lose money. But if they don't make war with each other, they'll make money. And then the Pope and the Church stand to gain a lot from it, right? Now, another big aspect that's going to happen as well, though, is this guy named Amerigo Vespucci is going to come along. And he's going to do most of his work in 1501. Now, he's going to notice from writings from Columbus and writings from other Spanish conquistadors, and then also maps that he himself personally made as an Italian cartographer, However, what Amerigo Vespucci is going to realize is that North and South America are not simply just islands, they're actually whole brand new continents, right? Massive land masses that actually are going to go much further than were ever expected. And so most of the people in Europe then honored him by way of his new maps and his new notations and called them the Americas, right? And that actually is where the name of the Americas comes from. Now, another big thing that's going to happen, though, as well, is a Portuguese sailor by the name of Ferdinand Magellan is going to attempt a thing known as circumnavigation. Now, circumnavigation, what that means is he is going to attempt to sail all the way around the world. This being Magellan right there, the Portuguese sailor himself, and this being the route that he took, right? He actually left Portugal, went all the way and bounced all the way around the bottom of South America, and he eventually would cross underneath South America right around in an area that is now known as Cape Horn. All right, so now, and he goes all the way around and then eventually pops out on the other side of the Pacific and continues his journey. Now, fun fact, he's actually the guy responsible for naming the Pacific Ocean as well. Magellan actually went through such severe storms down here at the base of South America that he said, oh my God, the water on the other side of this narrow strait of water is so much more peaceful and unstormy by comparison to what we just came through. It's so peaceful. We shall call it the Pacific, right? And the Pacific Passive Ocean, right? And then he floats his way on over here, and then he eventually goes to the Philippines where he dies. All right, so now he actually dies right there. So Magellan actually never finished his circumnavigation campaign. Actually, we believe the person that actually is responsible for the very first circumnavigation was actually a slave that he had on board with him named Enrique, all right? And he is actually probably the only member of the original vessel crew that went all the way around, and also it is believed that he might have actually done a lot of the piloting, right? So the interesting thing about it, though, is Magellan actually died. So fun fact, he actually didn't circumnavigate doodly squat. So say that next time you know somebody who's wearing a Magellan shirt, right? So going into it, though, also, you have to understand as well is that these new continents will attract attention, and they're going to actually, like, basically attract the attention of the of the French and the English. Now, the French and the English are going to attempt some early exploration of these areas, right? Jean-Paul Cartier is going to do some stuff up in North America towards Canada. Later on, you're going to see the Roanoke colony go missing, right? And some other things like that, but we'll talk about that stuff a little bit later on. But going into it, what you need to understand is that the early French and like English explorations that went there to try and see if they could find anything of being use was mostly in North America. And North America's climate is so harsh is that it's not going to really yield much of anything, right? It's actually going to be a pretty negative showing of everything. But what they will discover is a buttload of codfish right off the North American coast that does actually make them a little bit of money. And eventually, whenever the French actually show up in North America, they start discovering things like beavers and muskrats, and they actually get into the fur trapping business. Now, that's going to be a big thing a little bit later on. It'll be a very large element of their commercial growth. Now, notice what I just said. Commercial growth, right? We're talking about the French and the English actually finding a couple of new assets, and even they are getting in on these new products that are coming out of the Americas, right? Because this discovery of North and South America is going to lead to massive economic leaps, right? The commercial revolution is going to be a major aspect of that. We'll talk about it a little bit later on, but once the wheels of exploration really get moving and these Europeans start discovering items they never knew existed and had never seen before, things like chocolate, and pumpkins, and turkeys, and all these other things, it's going to rapidly drive up the commercialism and the growing commercialism that had already started in the Renaissance, right? Now, going into it, though, we also need to understand that this is also going to come off the heels of a massive amount of conquest of the Americas by the Spanish, right? So as we talked about with the last slide that we talked about with Columbus, he is going to adopt, and the Spanish are going to adopt a model of conquest, right? Rather than it being like a peacekeeping mission. And instead, they're going to go over there and decide to try and destroy native indigenous societies that have existed for thousands of years and were borderline Rome-like in sophistication, right? Now, the two main culprits for this, all right, that are going to lead large-scale expeditions that will lead to the downfall of major Native American civilizations are two men who are actually cousins, fun fact, Hernan Cortez and Francisco Pizarro, right? Cortez being the guy right here, who some of you might have actually heard referenced in the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, right? Because apparently they had Cortez's gold and they took it and it made them all skeleton-y and stuff. And then Francisco Pizarro being right here. Now, Hernan Cortez, okay, the interesting thing about him is he's going to abuse the dissension within the Mexican Empire to his advantage. Now, something you need to write down for Cortez, though, is when I say the Mexican Empire, I'm talking about all this stuff, right? Now, the Mexican Empire, though, is focused around one key thing, the Aztec, right? Now, we call it the Mexica Empire, though, due to the fact that the Aztec actually expanded over so much land. Because, see, something that we need to understand about the Aztec as well as the Inca that we'll talk about here in a couple seconds is that they're actually a wildly sophisticated Native American civilization, right? Not that the other ones were not, but this one in particular was on the burgeoning aspects of, like, ancient Rome, right? Ancient Rome, same people that made, like, large-scale, like, sporting arenas and massive religious temples, the Aztecs did it too, right? Okay? They had also a society replete with huge temples. And this right here is their city, known as Tenochtitlan, that actually was home to over 1 million people. It was built on top of water, right? Literally, it was actually built and constructed, and they farmed on top of water as well, using floating islands known as chinampas, right? And how were they able to take over so much land and area? They had a weapon that the rest of the Native Americans didn't have in the form of obsidian weapons, right? Actually lava rock that was laid into the side of wood who could cleave a man from, like, his shoulder all the way down to his midsection and his torso. And so their armies were pretty much unstoppable when they came up against Native Americans, right? Now you swing one of those obsidian swords though against a steel one or an iron one from from a Spanish conquistador, it's going to break, right? Like, because literally, like, obsidian is sometimes referred to as lava glass. Now, also something that the Spanish will observe underneath Cortez when they actually get there is that a lot of the people that are underneath the Aztec rulership don't like the Aztecs very much, right? Many of the tribes that the Aztecs took over did not like them, and that's what I'm getting at right here when he abused the dissension within the Mexican Empire. Cortez is literally going to go up to the people that the Aztec took over and find out from them that they don't like the Aztec. And one of the biggest leading reasons why is because the Aztecs practiced this thing known as human sacrifice, right? The Aztecs actually practiced a very sophisticated form of human sacrifice where they would actually remove the heart from a living person in honor of their gods, right? And actually particularly in honor of one god named Quetzalcoatl, right? Who was a flying snake god and stuff like that and the destroyer of worlds, right? And they were actually being led by this guy, a king of the Aztecs named as Moctezuma, right? His name was Moctezuma. Now, the thing about it, though, is that these people didn't like them because they were sick and tired of giving up their individuals as a form of tax to go off and be sacrificed to this, like, Aztec religion, right? So he abuses that dissension by making allies with those other people, and he rolls up on Tenochtitlan that has over 1.1 million people inside of it, and he actually took Moctezuma hostage, right? And he led a campaign of destruction and destroyed Tenochtitlan completely. Now, there's another element to this story that I will discuss here in a second that is much more important than anything else, right? Now, that story and the stuff that I'm telling you about the Aztecs and why they're so sophisticated is not something that they're ever going to ask on the AP test, but it's still something you should know, right? Because a lot of people and a lot of historians just gloss over the fact that the Aztecs are a wildly sophisticated individual or group, and just because they didn't have domesticated animals to actually, like, have immunity to large-scale diseases, and also because they didn't have forgeable metals because they didn't know how to access them or could not get to them, right? They had just begun playing around with the idea of smelting bronze, the Aztecs anyway. And so literally, it's not that they were primitive, it's just literally they just didn't have the resources that Europeans had, or the diseases, right? Now, the thing about it, though, going into it, is that Francisco Pizarro is going to do a similar thing, where he does not take over the Aztecs, though, he takes over the Inca, right? Pizarro conquested the Inca in South America and Peru after they had a massive civil war, right? Now, really quickly, for those of you who know what a civil war is a war between individuals within a country, right? So I'm saying the Inca had a civil war, right? There were two competing factions within the Incan, like, empire that competed against each other. And who they were is actually supporting two different kings. Basically, the Incan king had died, and his two sons then fought for the throne, right? Now, the one who ends up winning is a guy named Atahualpa, right? But he literally ended up winning just to be then killed by the Spanish after he got captured, because they literally set a trap for him, right? At this thing called the Battle of Cajamarca, the Spanish actually set a trap for Atahualpa, took him, and we'll talk about it in class because they're never going to ask about it on an AP test, but I still think it's something really, really important to know. But they actually took over Atahualpa and, like, set a trap for him, and they literally, a couple hundred Spanish conquistadors actually took out a several thousand strong Incan army with little to no effort, right? And a lot of that, again, has to do with the technology and the technological resources that Spanish people had at the time versus the Native Americans, right? The Inca literally were using weapons made out of rocks, right? And whereas literally the Spanish had guns and gunpowder. A big reason why the technological aspects that we talked about earlier, like guns and gunpowder, are going to be so important. And the Incas are very, very similar to the Aztecs in the fact that they also had large-scale architecture. That right there is Machu Picchu, right? They're a religious center. They did steep farming to actually be able to farm on the sides of mountains. They domesticated llamas. They had a no written language, but they had a numbering system called quipus, right, which is a form of knots on strings, right? And they did this because they actually had a sophisticated trade network that spanned the Andes Mountains over 10,000 miles, right? So again, the Incans are phenomenally intelligent. And also, fun fact, they sacrifice people as well, but they sacrifice children. So we'll go over that a little bit later on. I'm not glossing over it. They also mummified them too. Like legit, this like mummy right here is several centuries old, and she looks like she could just stand up, right? But she was actually sacrificed to the Incan religion, and we believe that she would have been in her teens. Now, the thing about it, though, going into it, but really quickly, not only did they have technological aspects that made them much stronger than the natives that they came into contact with, but the most important contributing factor to the takeover of these people was the Spanish technology and disease, right? Because once the Spanish began to make contact with the Native Americans that lived in North and South America, their diseases began to spread quickly, right? And the diseases that the Spanish carried with them were smallpox, measles, and influenza, to name the major three, right? There are several other ones that popped up as well, including a couple of STIs as well that actually are going to affect the native populations also. But the thing that we need to understand is that these diseases, right, and the fact that the Native Americans had no immunity to them, which we talked about in class a little bit, due to the fact that they didn't have large-scale domesticated animals or any kind of like interaction with the same animals that Europeans had come into contact with over thousands and thousands of years of cultural and civilizational development, is going to lead to them not having any immunity whatsoever to smallpox, measles, or influenza. And so these diseases will literally run rampant through these populations. Some historians predict that 90% of indigenous peoples that came into contact with Europeans died from these diseases or from malnourishment or being forced to work too much, or basically just interaction with Europeans in general, which if you ask me, that's a genocide, right? Now, because literally, okay, you're talking about 90% of these people will die, right? Now, again, some people say that a genocide may be like more deliberate, okay, which I think is like partially true, but like, you know what, it's still pretty bad, right? So now going into it though, what's going to then begin to happen as the Native Americans and their societies have been destroyed, right? And Atahualpa, the king of the Incans, has been killed. Moctezuma ends up dead as well, and the Spanish end up taking over these places. What they're going to do is start setting up colonies, right? And these colonies are going to be divided into things called viceroyalties, right? So what will eventually begin happening is the same thing that the monarchs are doing in Europe to grow their power, is basically the Spanish are going to begin to set up a more efficient system of governance where they can actually split this area into smaller areas and then give it to Spanish governors or viceroys, right? And these viceroys would report back to like the kings and queens and sending them different goods, right? See, here's the Viceroyalty of New Spain, the Viceroyalty of New Granada, Viceroyalty of Brazil, which, fun fact, actually belonged to Portugal because the tip of Brazil got cut off on that line of demarcation / Treaty of Tordesillas, and that's why Brazilians speak Portuguese, all right? So like now, like going into it though, all right, you also have to understand that after the splitting of this up happened, okay, into the different viceroyalties, so then began the farming and mining of precious minerals, right? Not farming of minerals, farming of goods, but then also the mining of minerals. Silver and gold are going to be discovered by the Spanish in replete, mostly due to some of the interactions that they had with the natives. So this guy that I said about earlier, Atahualpa, the king of the Incans, he actually was held ransom by the Spanish to his own people. And it turned out that the Incans had every ability to pay that ransom. They filled a room full of gold twice over and then again with silver, right? And if those Native Americans who did not have sophisticated tools and technology to be able to access all that gold and silver, that means that there was a bunch more there, right? Exactly, that they couldn't get to because it was too deep, okay? So silver and gold, since it was discovered by the Spanish in both the Aztec kingdoms and the Incan kingdoms, are going to start setting up mines to then harvest the rest of it out, right? As you can see right here, with literally natives bringing out massive amounts of gold right there, all right? You can also see this as well in the growing of sugar, right? It turns out that actually the conditions, the soil, the water retention levels, the humidity inside of South America is fantastic for growing sugar, so they end up planting a mess load of sugar. They also farm livestock, they ranched, but the better question about it is, though, is other than the fact that the sugar like industry will grow the Spanish ability to make a lot of money because it can make things like molasses and rum and sugar, of course, itself. But going into it, though, who is doing all the work? Well, you see it right here, noticing it in these pictures. It's not the Spanish, It's actually the natives, right? And the natives were forced to work underneath a system known as the encomienda system. So if the diseases did not kill you and you managed to survive them, you then may be forced to work until you died, right? And the encomienda system was a system created by Spain, right? Which, again, is a thing that's not in the College Board curriculum, which blows my mind, and I refuse to not teach it because it's stupid to not teach it, right? Spain granted the colonies the right to force the natives to work, which is a form of free slavery, right? Because here's the essence of the encomienda system, right? Not only the fact that disease and exhaustion killed 90% of some native populations, not only the fact that exhaustion and malnourishment and overworking killed them due to this encomienda system, but what in their minds made Spanish people think that this was okay to do, right? Because I think that's really, really important to put out there. What in the brain of literally a Spanish colonist at the time was like, well, you know what? This makes sense, right? We're going to force people to work until they die, right? Well, the thing about it, though, is that in the ultimate plan versus reality of the encomienda system, when we look at this, the plan was that Spanish settlers were like, oh, well, we will bring them underneath our military protectorate, we will care for them, and we will give them Christ, right? We will give them religion. And the natives will work a portion of their time for Spanish settlers. But in reality, what ended up happening is Spanish settlers forced long labor, did not pay Native American workers, failed to protect the natives, and seized their land as they began to die off, right? And what's going to happen to the natives? They're going to die from disease and harsh living and working conditions. The only reason that the encomienda system came to a close, other than the failing working population, the fact that there were not very many natives left to work after a certain fact, was literally because Jesuit priests that were being sent to the colonies observed what was going on and reported back and said it was disgustingly awful what was happening to the natives and that it must stop, right? And so literally, that is insane when you think about it. So all that's going on in South America, right? The encomienda system, the growing economic influence of the Spanish in those two areas. But back over in North America, we need to kind of go over what's happening there, right? Well, the English are going to try and set up shop in North America, as well as the French are going to try to set up shop in North America, okay? And those are our two big ones that are going to show up in North America, hence why a big chunk of Canada speaks French, right? Now, going into it, let's start with the French, speaking of, right, in Canada and stuff like that. Canada, the Mississippi River, and Louisiana are going to be the main area of their domain, right? The French are going to show up and begin to try and colonize in the late 1500s, focusing their efforts in Canada, riding the Mississippi River all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, and then also creating what you know of course, is the Louisiana Territory, right? Now, Louisiana itself and New Orleans itself actually was not founded and discovered. The mouth of the Mississippi wasn't discovered until much later, until the late 1690s, so we won't talk about that just yet, but that is going to happen. Now, the English, on the other hand, they're going to be on the inside of the French territory, right? Whereas the French were all the way up in the northern part of Canada, all the way down the Mississippi River and into the Gulf of Mexico. Some of you actually probably know or have realized, like thinking about a map, right? Well, there's a lot of area east of the Mississippi River, right? All those kind of original 13 colonies you should be thinking of, from Georgia up to basically New England, like in Massachusetts, okay? And also in Maine as well. Now, going into it, though, they're going to hug that Atlantic coast, okay? The early settlements are going to include Roanoke, which is, of course, going to be the one that gets lost. Jamestown is going to be settled around 1608, and it is going to be settled as a joint stock colony. Now, what that means, okay, is going to be a very, very important little aspect to the growing understanding of what's going on in this time period, okay? Joint stock company basically means that people invested in this colony, right? So basically think about it like this. Rosie doesn't have enough money to send a bunch of people off to start a colony in the hopes of discovering items or gold or silver so she can make a lot of money, right? She doesn't have enough money to set all that up. She doesn't have enough boats to set all that up, right? So instead, what Rosie does is she recruits individuals to invest in this with her, right? She puts up 25% of the investment, and then Mr. Terry comes in, and I put in 10% of an investment, right? And we keep adding up, and then Miley throws in, and then we've got, of course, Riley Penapinto throws in, right? And we all begin to track down investors who invest in this new joint stock company, right? And now when we find stuff there, right, and make money off of Pierre, and we discover Pierres there, wild Pierres there, that we can, take and eat and stuff like that and make us so much money. Oh, don't lick me in the mouth. Now, the big thing about it, though, we have to understand is what's going to happen, though, is when the money is made off farming these Pierres, I will get my investment share, right? I will receive my 10% investment. Rosie will get her 25% investment. If we made $100, Rosie gets 25 of it, I get $10, right? But that's just one little transaction. farming these wild Pierres, right? You're going to be like the dodo bird, and we're just going to hunt you into extinction. Now, going into it, though, what you need to also understand, that's how a joint stock company works. We'll talk more about that in class and review it a little bit, as we also will need to re-explain it when we talk about the East India companies and they rise up. We'll get to them here in a second. Now, the Plymouth colony is going to be another big one that pops up. It's also known as the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and it was founded by Puritans, right? And I know that y'all are reading that right now in Mr. Roddy's class, right? Y'all are reading I think you're reading the Crucible, right? You're going to read the Crucible, and y'all are going to talk about the Puritans and how they love to hunt witches. And now, really quickly, just so you know as well, the Puritans are Protestants, so we're kind of looking forward into the future. The Reformation is already going on. We got new types of like settlers and stuff like that. This is all going down in the 1600s, by the way. This is the hard part about European history, is there's so much different stuff happening all at the same time, is that you kind of got to look forward and then jump backward and then look forward and then jump backward, right? But the Plymouth colony was founded by Puritans, who are a form of Protestant, and they're actually Puritan separatists, right? Because they believe that you could not actually reform the Catholic elements out of the Anglican Church. But we'll again bring that back into focus when we get into the Reformation a little bit. And then you're also going to see later on Maryland, Pennsylvania, and stuff like that. The interesting part about English colonies, though, is their populations will grow very, very fast, right? And a lot of it has to do with the fact that the people that were actually going to these different colonies, the English colonies, and founding and settling in them were whole families, right? And indentured servants. And they were going there and they discovered a lot of items that made a lot of money. Now, the early settlements for the French, though, include Montreal, Quebec, Louisiana. Again, New Orleans will be a big colony that actually really gets off in the 1700s, particularly around 1712 when Bienville and Iberville, two brothers, actually commissioned to actually have the French colonize this area. The thing about it, though, is they had very low population, and their industrial and their agricultural output was very low, right? And a lot of this has to do that French colonies are just very, very different from English ones. French colonies are much more about fur trapping and journeymen. The way that French colonies operated is basically guys went over to America, trapped beavers and like other kinds of fur animals, and then they went back to France to sell it, and then they just stayed in France, right? So you see what I'm talking about? The colonies didn't grow very quickly underneath the French, whereas the English ones did, because it was whole families moving over together, as in, i.e. Puritan families or indentured servant families in Jamestown, right? Also, the French are going to populate some of the islands in the West Indies, including Saint-Domingue, which is now modern-day Haiti, right? MD Haiti doesn't mean Maryland Haiti. It means modern-day Haiti, right? Now, the thing that the English discovered, though, that makes them a buttload of money in this process is, of course, in Virginia, the Jamestown colony, the Native Americans showed them tobacco, right? And they start making tons of money, and they make the French really, really mad because their low population, low money output colonies are not living up to the super high population and also money-making colonies that the English are producing, right? And this is a colonial map right here of everything going down. You see what I'm talking about? So literally we've got the French right here in this middle area of the Louisiana territory. Then we also have the English colonies right there, okay? And then you have some Spain colonies down there as well. Now we've got a couple of little purple guys right here, right? Newfoundland, and then you've got Port Royal and stuff like that. A couple little areas as well. Who do those belong to? A mixture grab bag of things. Some belong to the French. Looking forward, though, by the 1700s, those areas will then go to the English because this stuff is going to create wars. These colonies and the race for these colonies does instigate some wars later on. By the 1700s, particularly in 1754, the French and Indian War will break out, which will actually pull most of the world at the time into a worldwide war, mostly over colonial holdings and land, right? Now, also, one other country tried to set up colonies in North America as well, and they're known as the Dutch, right? I.e. the people from the Netherlands, right? They attempted some early ones, right? That's why actually New York was originally called New Amsterdam, because literally the very first colonizers of the New York area were Dutch, right? Let's say, yeah. And that's why it used to be called New Amsterdam, hence why in the song where it's like blah, 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 blah.
In Constantinople, she'll be waiting in Istanbul. Even old New York was once New Amsterdam. Why they changed it, I can't say. People just liked it better that way.
Exactly. Now, the thing about it, though, is they've ended up actually pulling out of those areas after a couple of run-ins with the English and a couple of these wars and stuff like that, and they decided to focus much more on the growth of their East India Company. Now, notice I have 2 stars next to East India Company, because it's going to be very, very important later on, right? And what we're going to do, though, in class is we're going to start talking about the global market and the Atlantic slave trade a little bit, and then we're actually going to wrap everything up at a flip because we do not have much of this unit left. I think we have like 3 slides left total. We might actually potentially have the ability to finish the rest of it in class as long as we hustle, okay? So keep me focused, keep me on point, and we'll see if we can bang it all out so y'all can focus on studying for your first test, all right? But I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.